Technically, I've had or been treated for sepsis 3 times. I only recently found out about another time, which was in April 2019, where I was treated for biliary sepsis. But the story I'm kind of going to share today is about my kind of second and third cases of sepsis, which both happened in 2020. First of all in July 2020, and then again in November 2020. So I suppose with my story, you kind of have to go back a bit to when I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in 2017. For anyone else out there who's been diagnosed, particularly later in life, especially with type 1, it really kind of just turns your whole world upside down. Everything becomes about diabetes. And it was just, it meant leaving the place of work that I loved. I ended up moving to Cardiff because I thought it would be a good fresh start for me, particularly with this new kind of health condition. But that was a bit of a mistake. I say a bit of a mistake. It was a huge mistake because I thought, in a way, I could almost try and escape the diagnosis and the diabetes, which I didn't. And I fell into a huge kind of depression, and I just wasn't looking after myself. I wasn't kind of doing what diabetics are supposed to do. I wasn't taking my insulin. I just couldn't. It was all just too much. But that led me to develop peripheral neuropathy in my feet, or as the time the doctor called it, painful diabetic neuropathy. For anyone who has this as well, they will appreciate just how painful that experience is, and just how impossible to live with it is. It feels like walking through snow barefooted 24/7. Couldn't sleep, couldn't work, just can't function. It just, there were days where I wasn't able to even walk, and I would have to crawl to the bathroom or something. It was just such significant pain, and that initially I dealt with by drinking very heavily, which is actually how I ended up in hospital in April 2019, and I was treated for biliary sepsis, which I think the two were linked. But after coming out of hospital that time, although I managed to stop drinking heavily to try and help to get to sleep and things like that, I ended up turning to drugs, and I really kind of have to stress that this was sort of pain relief. I had never touched drugs before. It just wasn't kind of anything I ever thought would be part of my life. But I was just that kind of in a desperate situation that I needed something to cope with the pain, and that kind of escalated from kind of snorting drugs to IV drug use, which, because the more you take the drugs, the more that your kind of body builds an immunity to them, and you kind of need more and more, and then it became a case of needing more and more extreme ways in which to get that fix. And again, it was something that was giving me, not just kind of pain relief, but it was making me feel good. And even though I recognized that it was kind of a cycle and it wasn't actually helping things, it was making things worse. It was near impossible to stop. And it got to a point that because the veins all over my body were collapsed, and you couldn't, nothing was really working, I ended up kind of injecting into just the skin, which led to numerous bouts of cellulitis, like in my arms and my legs. And then, this is a bit gross, it's kind of like for anyone who's a Dr. Pimple Popper fan, I kind of got a bit kind of into this habit of picking at them and kind of trying to pop the wounds and stuff. I know that's incredibly grim, but we all kind of have weird hobbies, I suppose. So the first case of sepsis was because I'd been kind of picking at a wound in my arm, and that developed into the first case of sepsis. For about a week, I was bedbound, and I should also say, at this point, I was living alone as well, and I could just barely move. I was kind of coming in and out of consciousness. I wasn't even using drugs. I just was unable to move. And I think I eventually, and it's hard to remember sometimes because sepsis, gives you a very kind of hazy memory of what happened. And I think I just remember I managed to kind of reach for my phone one day. I think this was about a week after kind of, being in bed. My sister and her partner came up, and they could see what kind of a bad way I was in. And I remember there was this back pain that I just couldn't shift. It was just, and I had no idea that two were related. And my sister's partner was, I think he'd been like an emergency responder. And when he walked in, he said that he just knew that it was probably sepsis. I was refusing to go to hospital because I'd just been in and out so much. I just couldn't bear the thought of having to go in again. So they managed to call my GP, and they went down over to see him to get some oral antibiotics. Apparently at the time he told my sister if he doesn't go to hospital he will die. And by the time they came back, I think I'd been deteriorating. Ended up calling an ambulance, and they said that, you know, if I'd left it any later, probably wouldn't have survived. So I think they called it golden hour in which they found me. And so, you know, I was taken into hospital and was there for 2 weeks. Then, you know, so obviously, you know, after that I came out of hospital. I went back home for a couple of weeks. I think it'd been about a month since I'd last used. I thought I was better, returned to Cardiff. And I think that same day I relapsed, because I had some bad news from the work I was working at the time. That just kind of, I mean, I think I was probably looking for an excuse to use again because I was still in pain with the neuropathy and stuff. Not realising that by carrying on, it was continuing to make the neuropathy worse in itself, and you get caught in this cycle. So I began using again, and this time it got even, you know, kind of heavier and heavier because it was more difficult to use the drugs. This time, yeah, and I think between July and the next bout of sepsis, I think I must have gone into DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis, about 4 or 5 times, but I never called an ambulance. I just kind of tried to bring myself back, you know, to normal kind of sugar levels to try and kind of rescue myself. But then it got to the stage again where I was in bed for a week, and it was all the signs of that. I couldn't move. I was in a just terrible way, and that's the occasion I remember that I think I reached out to a family member and said, I think my mother, and said, right, yeah, you need to call an ambulance again. And it was kind of the same situation again where they came and they found me and they said, you know, not long, you know, if you left it any longer and that would have been the end. And this time the sepsis had started in my leg, and you could see it because it had like swollen bright red. And it was another 2 weeks in hospital and antibiotics. And I remember this time, because there was nowhere to put a cannula, they had to give me a central line so that I could get the antibiotics. Because they tried to put one in my arm, and they had to get an ultrasound machine. They had about 4 or 5 people all kind of like around my bed trying to get this cannula in, because my leg was just getting bigger and bigger. And I remember just screaming because it was the most agonising thing. You know, they couldn't find it, so eventually it was done by a central line. It's sometimes hard to remember exactly what was going on during those moments, because, you know, sepsis just kind of does things to your mind. I remember that feeling of, yeah, I'm going to die. Like I'd kind of come to accept it, and I kind of wasn't bothered by it. I just wanted the pain to end. Frankly, it wasn't a case of being suicidal. It was a case of I just can't cope anymore, and that's why, you know, just to explain again why I was using drugs more. The main reason I want to share this story is kind of twofold. One, you know, obviously for trying to help other people not get sepsis, but largely, you know, for IV drug users and that community, because I think it's something that's not talked about very much, and I can understand why. And, you know, the biggest thing I've learned, and if, you know, I try to think of it as like a silver lining, is that I've learned you can't judge people without knowing their story. You have no idea why someone does the things they do. You know, and I think of myself as a, you know, as a prime example of this, someone who used to be like the boffin at school, who was, you know, the teacher's pet. You know, this is how desperate I became. So I just really want to kind of reach out to that community as well, make them aware of, you know, I don't know if you'll be able to see massively in the recording, but my arms to this day are still quite kind of heavily wounded. They're much better than what they were, but, you know, I have a daily reminder of this is what you did to yourself. And, you know, the doctors told me that if I ever kind of relapsed and went back into it, I'd probably lose limbs. You know, obviously during the first day they had sent alcohol and drug support team round. They'd been in touch with my family and stuff, but obviously I think at that point I clearly just wasn't ready to hear it. I think you have to get to a stage if you're a user where it really finally clicks that this just cannot continue. And I think that it was the second case of sepsis that really hit that home for me. And I remember one of the team, he was a former user himself, and he came around and spoke to me, and that made a really big difference because he was not judgmental. He kind of could understand where I was coming from, and kind of wasn't just kind of saying to me, don't do it because it's bad. He kind of explained kind of more, and actually I reached out to him a couple of months ago to thank him and say, look, this is where I am now. But upon leaving hospital, I didn't actually know much about sepsis. It was kind of, I think a lot of people think sepsis is you have the infection, you get treated for the infection, and then you're fine. But so I had never heard of post-sepsis syndrome. I had no idea that recovery could take so long and be so much more difficult. It's kind of almost like having a second chronic disease like diabetes, because it leaves so many kind of after effects, kind of, physically, mentally. For months, I was exhausted. I just could barely move, get up. I just wanted to sleep all the time. Doing little things took huge amounts of energy and effort. Going up and down stairs, just going to the toilet. Brain fog. I'm still not quite right. People used to tell me that, I was really bright and quick about things. Whereas I don't feel like that anymore. I don't feel as quick as I used to be. I feel like I kind of stumble or stutter a lot more than I used to, or that I find it hard to get my words out. As someone who's a massive talker as well, with adult ADHD, that's not normally a problem, but it still can be a bit challenging, like processing things. So I think it was about it's when I had returned to work in August 2021 that I thought something's still not quite right. And so I just did a bit of Googling, and that's when I came across the UK Sepsis Trust. And it all just made sense. When it's finally kind of like a click moment and you think, God, they're just talking about everything that I'm experiencing with, kind of fatigue, memory loss, brain, I think I've said brain fog. I mean, do you see what it's very easy to kind of get caught up in things. And I know a lot of people get this anyway in general, but to go from someone who didn't have that kind of issue to now. And so I ended up arranging to have a call with one of the team. And it just made a huge difference, kind of coming across this whole community of people that have been through such a similar experience. Everyone is tailored individually to what happened to them, but we all went through that same process of, nearly dying. And that's kind of the weird thing that we all have to kind of accept, is that we all got to that point. And, I then kind of joined the Facebook group, the support group, and that's just been incredible for just talking to other people that literally describe the exact same symptoms as you, the same struggles, even if it's years later. Because I had my 3-year anniversary last Saturday, and it's still affecting you to say. Some people, it's 8 years on and they're still being affected. Some people recover from sepsis really quickly, and that's great for them. But sepsis affects the people, not necessarily the ones who had sepsis, but loved ones that had sepsis. Some people don't survive, and I often get that sense of survivor's guilt because I look back on how I gave myself sepsis, how I saw I feel responsible for that, and I think, why is it fair that I survived twice but others don't? And that can be hard to process, but that's why I also now really enjoy volunteering for the UK Sepsis Trust. I feel like they've given me a huge amount in terms of support, and in a way we were kind of all laughing about this the other day, that without sepsis we wouldn't have all been brought together as a community to help each other. So it's very strange how the universe works out. But so that's why now I volunteer for the monthly support groups, the recovery support groups. Just because it's really important for other people to hear that they're not alone. That many of us who have survived sepsis, and that's the way to try to look at it, you're a survivor. We all deal with similar issues to this day, and so we try to swap good news stories, which tries to cheer people up, or kind of swap tips and things that help us get through the day, because sometimes it is about just trying to survive each day from one day to the next. What I really like about the online recovery support groups is just how relaxed and kind of laid back it is. It's very informal. There's no pressure. The the facilitators of the session, which I think I've seen either Oliver or Emma, they're always just so friendly, welcoming, and it's just a very kind of natural flow, and kind of people are welcome to sit there and say nothing. If they don't want to say anything, they don't have to have their camera on. It's not recorded, there are no photos taken, it's totally private. And people like myself, we volunteer and attend just to kind of make people feel welcome and able to share their story. I can't praise or thank my family enough. I'm so lucky that I had them, because there are lots of people out there, particularly IV users, who don't have that kind of support. So they would be, even whilst I was using, they'd be reaching out to me, trying to help me. They were with me. They've been with me from day one, I suppose, as it were. And I couldn't have done it without them. So I'll never forget when my sister said to me, and my mum said to me, they didn't think I was going to make it past Christmas. And you don't really, when you're using it particularly, you don't think about the impact you're having on your family. I know I wasn't at the time, So it's kind of, these are also reasons why you don't ever want to go down that route again, because you don't want to put your family through it. One of the big things that kind of keeps me going, I'd say it's probably the main thing, is work, because I'm back in that place that I was working before, pre-diabetes, in a role that I love, in a team that really, really supports me. They've really gone out of their way to, kind of make reasonable adjustments where needed to kind of help me, be able to work, but also kind of live, I suppose, as well. So that's made a big difference. And, I suppose it's an incentive to stay kind of clean, as it were, and, because I just wouldn't want to ever risk going down that route again. Because I wish I could speak to my previous self. Tell them to stop. Because it doesn't make it any better. You're just making the pain worse. You're hurting your family. And it's not worth it. It's not worth putting yourself through that. Sepsis is the worst thing I've ever experienced. And I wouldn't wish it upon anyone, so if I could tell my previous self, sorry, I'm such an ugly crier, if I could tell my previous self to do anything to avoid getting sepsis, I would.